Do you want to go ahead? Oh, awesome, Shelly. Thanks for starting the recording. We are really excited to present to you a little bit more information on a survey that you may or may not have participated in. These are some of the results of that survey, and then we want to have a discussion about what these things mean. So I will go ahead and share my screen with you so that we can walk through a PowerPoint because there's a lot of really good stuff in here. So don't worry, we will definitely have some time for conversation towards the end. All right. Chris, can you see this PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, great. I just see you on my list, on my page.
You want me to give you a thumbs up when I want you to advance, or?
Yeah, that will work.
Okay. How is everybody doing today? It's good to see everybody. Wish we could be doing this in person, but really excited to be here today with Drs. Rodriguez and Cline and Balschweid. Want to give a special shout out to Dr. Cline. I know she's on the session, and so she's at home with a week old baby now, and so congratulations to Dr. Cline for that. And so just to start out, like Mary mentioned, many of you probably saw this survey come through. I guess in the fall is when we administered this survey to the membership of AAAE regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion within the association. And so really this group has been working together going on about 3 years, a little over 3 years now, in terms of looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion as part of the strategic plan. And so in here just a little bit, Mark is going to talk a little bit more about that strategic planning process and kind of what brought this about. But first, if you'll advance, Mary, what we've got planned for today is we're just going to talk a little bit about the survey itself, give some results in terms of just a description of what the membership of AAAE looks like. Then we're going to talk about some of the quantitative data that we got out of the survey, as well as some of the qualitative themes from the open-ended questions. And then we're going to have a session at the end where you're going to have an opportunity to group up and reflect on kind of what we've talked about today and some of the issues that we're facing, and then followed by kind of looking to the future and where we want to head as a profession in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So with that, Mark, I think you're next up to talk a little bit about the strategic plan.
You bet. Thanks, Chris. So this survey started out of the first goal of our current AAAE strategic plan. And that goal was on the initial slide that really asked the question, how do we become a more inclusive society as a profession? And really looking at if we get to the end of this strategic plan, 5 years from now, how do we look out across the membership and see at our national and regional conferences more faculty of color? How do we get to a point where we see more graduate students from underrepresented minorities? How do we go about expanding our disciplinary focus beyond just school-based agricultural education to include those elements within many of our departments that represent leadership, represent communication, represent extension, and then also to get to a point where our membership is reflective of all kinds of institutions. And I think of our historically Black colleges and universities, Hispanic serving institutions. How do we get to a point where we have tribal colleges represented, where we have maybe state, regional, private institutions that are also working in this space of social sciences within agriculture, food, and natural resources. And so that was really the set of questions that led us to say, do we really even know what the demographics of our current membership look like? And that would be a baseline, at least, to get us started from.
So a little bit about the survey. So as a work group, we started to pull together this survey kind of the end of last summer. And Dr. Cline kind of did a lot of work on this in terms of kind of pulling together instruments that were out there, as well as creating some items for the instrument that we sent out to the profession. And so really the whole purpose of this survey, and for those of y'all that took it knew it was a long instrument, it had a lot on it. But really the purpose was to get a better grasp of who our membership is, who is in AAAE, and then really what their perceptions, what y'all's perceptions are in terms of how that's related to DEI for the AAAE Society. And so when we sent this out, we sent it out to 829 members, or at least on the membership roster. And we had a 46.7% response rate. So 387 folks responded back to the survey. And so we had items, referring back to what Mark was talking about, there were items related to not only the demographics of folks in the profession, but items related to diversity, related to inclusion, items related to specifically looking at, race, ethnicity, ability and disability, LGBTQ, and other items as well. And so, we want to really try to look at encompassing all of those areas. And as we're kind of sifting through this data still and kind of looking where we're going to head with this, there's a lot to kind of unpack as we think about this. And so, and it was really interesting to note as well, and Mary will get to this later, just in terms of the qualitative data, the open-ended responses that we got with this survey was just astounding. The amount of, not only just, the amount, but the quality of the responses in terms of what we got from the membership. So Mary, you want to move ahead? So just some real quick demographics and looking at the respondents of this survey. And so you can see that out of the respondents, and so when we look at tenure versus non-tenure track respondents, about 2/3 of the folks who responded to this item were tenure track at their institution. And you can see that we also had some master's students, doctoral students who also responded to the survey. In terms of race and ethnicity, you can see that in the little blue box there, that the overwhelming majority of respondents to this survey identified as Caucasian or white, followed by Hispanic and Latinx, with almost 6% of our respondents being Black, African American. And then you can see the numbers for the rest there. And then in terms of ethnicity not listed, you can see on the left-hand side that there were several responses to ethnicities not being listed: Eastern European, Central Asian, mixed, and Caribbean Islander as well. In terms of religious affiliation, you can see that just over 50% of respondents identified as Protestants, with about 14, almost 15% Roman Catholic, and then followed by, you can see at the bottom, we had several who preferred not to answer that question, some who had none, then religious affiliation not listed, and you can see that list on the left-hand side as well. In terms of sexual orientation, you can see that 87% of respondents identified as straight, heterosexual. And then our groups down from there, you can see that was followed by 14 folks who preferred not to answer. And then we have gay, lesbian, or homosexuals at 4.21%, sorry, of respondents. And then bisexual and queer, followed by asexual. And then no one chose to say that there was not listed, or their sexual orientation was not listed. In terms of ability and disability status, excuse me, you can see that the percentages were not large in terms of folks who identified identified and said that they had some of these disabilities or disability statuses. However, you can see that vision or hearing sensory impairment was the highest at 5.38%, followed by folks who identified with a mental health illness, and you can see the rest of the list there. And some folks who also did prefer not to answer, and we had about 3/4 of the folks who did not identify with a disability or impairment at all. One of the things we were interested in this survey is looking at situations regarding folks' ability to potentially maybe not participate in AAAE, whether it's conferences, events, things like that, due to other responsibilities. And so some of those things might be childcare or elderly care. And so you can see by the responses here that about 40% of folks regarding childcare have current childcare needs or anticipate that they will have those needs in the future, and close to 60%, with 8.79 of that being having current elderly care needs, and then about 50% saying that they anticipate that they will have those needs in the future. So in terms, Mary, is this one yours? No, this one's still mine, sorry. So in terms of looking at level of agreement related to participation and involvement. So the first item here, I feel that there are opportunities for me to pursue leadership in AAAE at the regional level. And then the second one is, I feel there are opportunities to pursue leadership at the national level. And you can see that more folks agreed, somewhat or strongly agreed, that they have opportunities at the regional level versus opportunities at the national level. And so you can see that that percent that disagreed actually grew, almost doubled on the disagree when we look from the regional to the national level. When we look at folks' perceptions of how their perspectives are valued by AAAE members, almost half would agree, but we still have a pretty large group, almost 29% of folks who disagreed in terms of thinking about how their perspective is valued by AAAE members. When we look at opportunities to serve in the organization, about 2/3 of folks agreed somewhat or strongly that there are opportunities to serve, which is more than when you look nationally at the folks who talk about leadership in the organization. And then the last item there, opportunities to be awarded or recognized, just a little over half agreed. And then we've got about 1/4 of folks who disagree with that statement as well. And so you can see that some of those are on the disagree or marked, even though they're low percentages, you know, anywhere between 1/4 and 2/3% of respondents. You know, we start thinking about that in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion. It's important to kind of point out that there are, you know, a chunk of folks out there that feel that way.
So now we're starting to go into, if your eyes haven't glazed over just yet, there's a lot of data, but we think it's really important to present this stuff to you. So bear with us. This next part is looking at the barriers to inclusion and also the perceptions of how we've changed over the last several years from the perspective of folks in our association. So here we look at the barriers limiting engagement in the organization. You can see that some of the biggest is financial. It's not just personal finances, but it's also university, college, and department finances. How are people able to afford to get here? This is not something new to us. We recognize that finances are tight all the way around. And I think that this is something that we really need to consider moving forward, especially when it comes to facilitating engagement. When it came to feeling included, some of them felt that that was a barrier. About almost 15% felt that that was a barrier. Again, like Chris said, even though this is a small percentage, it's still a percentage worth looking at and understanding that there's still folks in our association that the barrier to engagement is actually because they don't feel included. When we look at the perceived diversity of the membership, here you can see that people slightly agree or say that they believe that we're slightly diverse or not diverse at all, with about almost 15%. The majority of folks said that we're slightly diverse, about 24% said we're moderately diverse. So we have a ways to go, but we'll look at the perceived increase here in a minute of how we've changed over the last several years. So this is currently the perception of diversity. And diversity we didn't really give a definition here. And so this was, I think it's important to note that this was subjective to the person answering this question. So let's take a look of level of progress towards diversity and inclusion related to, in particular here, gender and gender identity. To look at this graph, you can see this is the number of responses or the percentage, and this is how much we've grown or how much they believe that we've changed. Lauren, is this correct? So sorry to call on you. No, you have a baby.
No, you are correct.
Okay, just making sure. All right, thanks for chiming in, Mama. Okay, so we can see here that diversity of membership is on the left, diversity of leadership is in the middle, and inclusivity of membership is on the far right. And so here, when it comes to gender and gender identity, that we still have a ways to go when we look at the level of progress in our membership, the diversity of our membership, and the diversity of our leadership. You can see, though, that we are starting to make a little bit of progress, according to folks, in the inclusion, in the inclusivity of membership when it comes to gender and gender identity. I think that it's important to note, too, here, though, that gender and gender identity can be, that they're two different things. And so I think that when people think gender, they think, male or female. And when they think gender identity, there's the association of how you identify. And so while it depends on the eye of the beholder on this question, if they were thinking about, oh yeah, women are totally, we see women in our membership, we see more women in our leadership, we see more women in the inclusivity of membership. So just be thinking about that as you kind of take a look at some of this data. When it comes to sexual orientation, so the level of progress is significant. It's really good, guys, but we still have a lot of growth to do. And so here is an opportunity for us to look that the perceived level of progress of diversity of membership has increased, the leadership a little bit less, and the inclusivity within the membership. So it looks to me, when we look at this data, that folks do see that there is a progress to the culture and the space around being inclusive to sexual orientation. And this is, again, from the beholders of those who the majority were straight, just to put that note out there. When we look at race and ethnicity, here is where we see the complete opposite. The perceived level of progress towards the diversity and inclusion within our membership, our leadership, and our diversity and inclusivity and diversity of leadership. Here you can see that a lot of folks said that we are making some progress, but it was not the majority of respondents.
Hey, Mary.
Yeah.
You had a question in the chat about the scale and how to interpret this scale.
Sorry, Lauren, can you chime in here?
Yes. So on the instrument, everyone was given kind of a sliding scale of 0 to 100. And so they were asked to just rate what they felt like the perceived level of progress was in the organization. And so they could slide that bar anywhere along that 0 to 100. And so then what we did in putting the data together is then we created these kind of 4 categories so that we saw what percentage of people responded in that 0 to 25%, rating scale, what percentage of folks responded in 26 to 50, and so forth. So this is their rating on that scale of 0 to 1 or 0 to 100, and the percentage of respondents that responded in those 4 sections, if that makes sense.
That was a lot clearer than I explained it, Lauren. So thank you so much for that. Guys, I did the qualitative stuff, duh. So we'll keep going and we'll keep kind of working through this, but just take a look and thank you for answering that question, Lauren. And if you have other questions, just drop them in the chat and we'll address them as we can. When it looks like the inclusion and diversity of rank, when it comes to the membership and inclusivity within the membership, you can see when the diversity of membership that about 30% of folks said that we still have a ways to go, that we're still not demonstrating a lot of progress here. But when it comes to the inclusivity of membership and the diversity of membership, that you can see that we're starting to include more. So remembering that diversity and inclusivity are two different things. Diversity is whether they're present, and inclusivity is whether they're actually being engaged and really getting to, just be present in the association as much as they can be. Socioeconomic status, I think that this was also another question that was a little bit difficult to answer because you don't usually know socioeconomic status at a conference of different individuals. But I think that when folks were looking at this, hopefully they were thinking about who is actually present there. So I think I'm just going to skip over this one because it's not as essential to some of the stuff we're doing. You're laughing. It's okay. Thanks, Shelly. All right, religious representation. This was something that has come up in conversation a lot with folks in our association. So looking at diversity across the board here, it still shows that 40%, about 40% of folks still say that we have some ways to go for religious representation. The inclusion of the disciplines. This is always something that comes up when we talk about diversity. Oftentimes people go to, oh, well, we include AgCom or we include Ag Leadership. And this is just one small component of diversity and inclusion when it comes to our association. But you can see that about 30-ish%, 30 to 35% or so said that we're making progress, but we're probably not where we should be. All right, this is my jam. So let me tell you a little bit about some of these qualitative themes that came out. Guys, we had a ton of open-ended responses when it came to this, and it was really interesting to read. When we started to look at the barriers of inclusion, the challenges that people face, a lot of things did come back to finances and to some other pieces, but I really wanted to highlight some of the things that did stand out that aren't things that we would just automatically go to when we think of what do we look at with diversity, equity, and inclusion of our association. There's a lot of change needed, and in particular, we really need to focus on the political structure, and looking at the political structure means looking at the leadership, how leadership is chosen, how people have the ability to voice their concerns and voice their opinions in our association. But we also need to make some really strong cultural changes. When we looked at the data, it demonstrated that people felt that they didn't have a lot of agency. Agency meaning ability to impact choices or decision making within the organization. There was a lot of commentary about graduate students or from graduate students stating that they didn't even have voting rights or didn't really even get to engage in that way. And so how are they supposed to exert agency when they can't even vote? And so those are things that we need to consider. There's also other pieces that came into that conversation, or different folks said obviously a lot of different things, but some of them said that, you know, as in the different ranks of their careers, that sometimes they didn't feel like they had the agency to express themselves in this association that is so strongly associated with job access and tenure and promotion process with letter writing. And so being very thoughtful about what that means for the agency of individuals within our organization. The second one here is who is included and excluded and why. There were different responses here. People said that they felt very excluded because their research wasn't welcome. They weren't part of the Ag Ed group. There was also some talk here about how different universities can be very prominent in our national association, and how that sometimes causes an in-group and an out-group and some exclusivity. That also came up in different responses. I say conversation because I thought they were conversing with me when I was reading this. But there's things that we need to be thoughtful about when it comes to the inclusiveness of getting people in here if they're not having research appointments. So our association is heavily research, right? That's all you do is you come and present research papers and posters and presentations and whatever. But what about the people that are heavily teaching, and how are they being included in this space? And why are they being, you know, is it purposeful exclusion because this is the way that our association has run? And do we need to make changes to that kind of stuff? Other pieces is who is recognized, how how are our awards being chosen, and how are people being recognized in the association, from graduate students to outstanding presentations, papers, etc. And that even includes the selection of fellows and those types of things. So being very thoughtful about who is recognized. This last piece is really about the leadership, who is at the table, who is making the decisions and why. Is there purposeful inclusion of different folks at different levels to be able to talk to some of those challenges that may not be brought up? I think that it's also really important to consider when we say who is at the table is whose voice is loudest and who is really not being heard. And the last part is who actively engages and how. A lot of the responses here about engagement really varied. Some of them said that they were very active at the regional level as opposed to the national level, because the engagement is much easier at the regional level, not just for funding and accessibility, but also because it was more open to the types of presentations or posters or things that was being shared. It's also, they felt that it was several participants felt that it was a much more open space to be able to collaborate and have conversations with smaller groups of people. And it was just easier to get to. I think that this is something else to consider about active engagement, is what level of professors and graduate students are engaging in these spaces. Some of them mentioned how they may have been very active as young assistant professors, but then when they got tenure and promotion, just kind of started to find their way into different spaces or just not come anymore. There were several people that did respond to the survey that said, I haven't been to a national meeting in 15 years or however long. And so we did get some answers from people that haven't been engaged in a while. All right, that was a lot. So what does this mean? We're hoping that you guys can tell us. Just kidding. But not kidding. Mark, this is you.
All right. So at this point, what we thought would be beneficial after sort of getting this data dump would be to have breakout opportunities for us to discuss this. And there's 3 specific questions that we have to ask you. And those 3 questions are on your screen at this point. And in order to sort of help capture this in a way that makes sense, because after our breakouts, we want to be able to come back and just do a debrief of the high-level conversation that occurred in the breakouts. Chris is going to walk us through how to use a software application that will help us record that.
Yeah, so here in a minute, Mary's gonna divide everybody up and put everybody into breakout rooms. And what we're going to be using is a website called Padlet. And so here in a second, let me actually copy this web address. So in the chat, there is going to be an address that you can follow that goes to a Padlet room. And so you can open up that Padlet, and once you are in your breakout groups, we want you in your group to choose one person to be a reporter to record in the Padlet. And so what you can do is, and Mary, I'm going to see if I can share my screen real quick so I can show the Padlet. So everybody should be able to see that Padlet. So when you get into Padlet, what you can do is you go down here onto the right, you click that, and it basically opens up a virtual Post-it note. And so you can, put whatever group you're in, and then you can just, talk about your ideas, whatever it is that y'all come up with in the pad itself. And so y'all will be able to watch real time in the Padlet as everybody's kind of typing. And so it's kind of a neat little application and to be able to see what folks are doing. So what questions do y'all have about using this? Should be able to access it.
Chris, I don't have a question about using it, but could you explain the population in your very beginning, 800 and some people? That number surprised me.
Yes, so the and I'm going to use this term very loosely, Dr. O, the roster for AAAE has, I think now I've heard a little over 900 folks. Tracy, we had this discussion in our meeting not too long ago. You may be able to jump in. But I think that is, I don't know, I'm not sure if that's the directory or the roster, because there's been discussion about, using the directory as a sampling frame. But there are a little over 900 folks now that are listed either as current or I think potentially past members. Tracy, can you help with that?
Yeah, I think what we figured out is that's everybody that hasn't been deleted. So there's some current, there's some inactive, there's some non-members on there that end up in the directory because from the North Central region, when people register for a conference, and there's some grad students that are in there twice. There's actually some faculty that are in there twice.
Okay, thanks.
All right.
All right, everyone. So I'm about to open up the breakout rooms. Again, here are the questions to consider here in your chat. So you'll be able to take those with you. You'll be able to reopen them. What we're asking you to do is use the Padlet for you guys to document some of your ideas so that we can see them in real time. So each group, if one of the members of the group just wants to be the note taker in that group, that would be great. Or you guys can just add it all together. That's okay too. But I'm just going to let everyone know I'm going to mark one person who's going to know what room you're in. So Donna, you're in room number 1. Chris Estepp, you're in room number 2. Shelly, you're in room number 3. And Brian Myers, you're in group number 4. So just when we come back, that'll just be easy to kind of talk together. All right. So I'm going to open them up.
Which Donna did you put in one?
Excuse me. Westfall Red.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry.
Could you say those? Could you say those again, Mary?
Sure. Donna Westfall Red, room number 1. Chris Estepp, room number 2. Shelly, room number 3. And Brian Myers, room number 4. When you guys are in there, you'll know what room you're in because the rest of your group will be there. We'll see you soon.
You bet. Welcome back.
Do you want me to share the screen with the Padlet, or are you just going to have folks talk?
I would ask Shelly, Chris, Brian, and Donna, would you need the Padlet up on the screen in order to summarize?
I'll just pull it up.
There we go.
Awesome.
All right. Well, welcome back, everyone. Excited to hear a summary of comments. And I would say, based on the time we have, if you could keep your summary to 2 to 3 minutes of the most salient points that came up during your breakout session, that would be great. And so Donna Westfall Red, if you could help us with group 1.
Thank you. And I would say that comments in the other groups are really parts of things we would support as well. Just 2 things I would point out. Core to what we talked about. How do we access non-members and expand the population to discover what the barriers or missed opportunities are within the profession? I think some of us have been talking about that. That's not a new question, but still is a question. And then how are we going to act on the things we find out? And I think that's a bigger piece too, is what action are we going to take after we've identify the responses to some of these questions. And then the other core thing we talked about was the structure of our conferences, because it was interesting as we talked about membership and engagement and inviting others, that we felt that the structure of the conference, maybe in limiting what the research sections looked like, what the topics end up being around, and there's a number of things within that. But and then we're saying, oh, well, the structure of the conference really, how would we invite people, is that really going to work? If our structure is limiting the number of people we think we can invite and how those folks would engage with us and how everyone would engage with each other, if that is a real concern, then we need to have a real conversation about the structure of our conferences. And because if we're trying to recruit people and then the conference is the barrier, that That's counterintuitive. Anyway, so we have other ideas in our Padlet if you'd like to look at them, but those are anchor pieces to our conversation.
Thank you, Donna. Chris, group 2, could you summarize, please?
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about just how the data show that we are, as an association, becoming more open to diversity, but then our conversation also kind of centered around, Dr. Osborne brought up a really good point about we can't dictate who comes into the profession, and we talk about becoming more diverse, but yet we lack diversity. And so, we start thinking about that. It's like, how do we do that, in terms of, increasing the diversity. And so that was one of the conversations that we had. Additionally, we had a discussion just about the data and who did not respond, looking at that number of folks, beyond the 300 something that responded. And so, what are their perceptions? Why are they not responding? More than likely, these are folks who are not going to be involved in AAAE. And then that led into the discussion about, when we did the strategic planning, how there was data collected from folks who have not been involved. And so that may be another good thing to look at in terms of, thinking about moving forward is looking at that data from the strategic planning process. And then lastly, when we talked about some things that we could do, some changes that could be made, we talked about mostly regional institutions, but institutions where folks have, high teaching appointments as opposed to research appointments. What types of things could we do at our conferences and in the profession that advance, the other 2/3 of our appointment beyond research? And so, there was some discussion about that, focusing on teaching and service and other things. And then in thinking about grad students, how can we include grad student voices as well? And one of the really good things that came up was just an idea of, having a grad student member on each of the committees as a member to have a voice on those committees as well. And so that was kind of just a quick summary of the things that we talked about in our group.
Thank you, Chris. Sounds like you had some good discussion. Shelly, if you could be the voice for summarizing group 3.
So as far as what we learned about our membership, our discussion kind of centered around, we learned about what we expected to learn. The data wasn't, super surprising in terms of demographics or the disciplinary divides. And then I think it was Trey or maybe Stacy who posed the question of how is this tracked over time? What changes have been made and how do we want to see that change in the future? What's that goal? On things that would be good to know, Stacy brought up that, this is only 1/3 of the members completed this, and then 1/3 of those were students. So maybe getting a little bit more information out there. Another question came up for good things to know for as far as inclusivity is maybe this might be a cool qualitative study, but what has worked for incoming professionals, like their experiences their first time at AAAE? When was that moment that they felt included or part of it? Like I remember, when I actually felt part of the association. And then the other good question to ask would be, who is not here and why are they not here? As far as changes to make, we talked about very tangible changes and then more changing the culture and inclusivity of the entire association. That's a wow, okay, let's, that's a big undertaking. But in the meantime, there are very tangible, air quote, easier things that we can do to reach some of our DEI goals. That could be anything from, we know from your research that you have people with sensory impairments. I mean, that looks very different if you're deaf or blind, but still there are things like posting transcripts with these that can be done to be in compliance with that and to be more inclusive. So maybe starting with checking off things that we can do easily to get the ball rolling. And then that's most of it in a nutshell. Oh, and as far as rank, we did talk about what do we want that to look like? What's the right balance there even before we start going on that? We didn't have an answer to that. We just were brainstorming.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Shelly. And then to round us out with group 4, Brian Myers, if you could summarize that discussion.
I don't think he's here.
Was there somebody
Brian
in
had to go
group?
to another.
I think Brian has left the building.
We
Okay.
haven't had another 2 o'clock meeting.
Oh, sure.
I think he
I'll
was
do it, Mark.
intimidated.
So one of the things that we talked about was, does the organization actually reflect the history of programs across the nation and when our new disciplines developed and how many graduates we have and those kinds of pieces that might be worth looking at. And a question of why is it that the conference comes up a lot in this conversation, not the association? You know, is the conference the barrier, or are there other things that we could be doing throughout the year as an association that don't have the same barriers as the cost of going to a conference? We talked about the same value kind of thing. What are opportunities for providing funding for those who can't? It also came up the things about like continuous membership, and that there may be years that you don't have the funding to maintain the continuous membership, or you need to be a member in a different organization and you've got to redirect funding. And are we considering those things in the bigger picture, like awards that require 5 years of continuous membership? Now we've excluded people and potentially unintentionally not thinking about some of those bigger life event kind of things that happen. And then the other piece we talked a little bit about was going back to that directory and thinking about profiles and what the directory looks like for us to be able to identify who members are, and that how are we connecting with people, inviting them to apply for awards, inviting them to committees. We tend to do the same thing that we probably do at our institutions when we invite students to apply for awards. It's the ones that you know, the ones that you see, the ones that are around, who may be the most qualified, but they may not be. It may just be somebody that you've not interacted with yet. But if without having kind of that almost Facebook profile, you don't have that experience with individuals that you haven't met in person. But we also talked about some of the other things about is it the expected organization? Do you go because for your P&T packet, you need letters from people that were at the meeting? Because your advisor said that's the place that you're supposed to be? Those kinds of bits and pieces too.
Thank you for that, Tracy. I appreciate you stepping into that role. And this is all great feedback. This is helpful. Outside of this same professional development workshop that Mary and Lauren delivered for North Central region, this is really the only other feedback we've gotten on the data that was presented. So with that, Mary, I will turn it back over to you.
Sure. So like Mark said, guys, this is really important for us to get feedback. And it's not because we want to improve our study, which we know that there are things that we could improve, you know, especially in the delivery. I should probably know the scales better. Sorry about that. I relied heavily on Lauren, but then she's busy. So, you know, I think that at the end of it all, this is the question that I want to know. So what, right? Like, so where do we go from here? One of the things that we're very good at is gathering data. And one of the things that we're not very good at is the so what piece. And so what do we do with this information? How do we go from here? Where do we go from here? How do we incorporate these learnings into something that we can do something with? So our exercise and getting some feedback from you guys is not just about feedback. It's really about getting you also thinking about what is your role, and how can you make a difference if this is something that you want to make a difference in. It should be. So let's kind of take a look. There are some things already happening, which is really great. There is a DEI special committee that is led by Brian Myers and Lori Moore. And it was tasked to folks to make tangible suggestions for change to the AAAE leadership. And so Lauren and I have been working with this group in particular, helping them dive through in depth a lot more with this data and to see and to challenge what are some of the recommendations that can be made. A part of that process is also we need to reach out to the membership and say, hey, these are some things that we need to be thinking about changing. What else does the membership have to say about this? So there's a lot of movement in there and a lot of good stuff coming out of that. So I'm hopeful that these things can be taken to the AAA leadership and they will be very open to hearing what some of the recommendations that come out of this group. There's also these incredible identity and inclusion hangout groups led by Donna Westfall Rudd that folks are engaging in and having conversations in already, and it's a really great opportunity to not have just the space to kind of air grievances, but also to connect with people that have similar research interests or areas of expertise that the folks really want to connect with. So that's really awesome. There's also been some really great professional development sessions this year. The one comment that I will make about the professional development series is that there was one that was really, really great on LGBTQ people in agriculture and agricultural education. And it was really awesome. If you haven't seen it, I recommend going to see it. But one of the things that I realized when I was trying to tell a student about it is that they couldn't access it because they weren't members. And so that's something else to be thinking about is, when we talk about professional development, are these things that we are only offering to a membership and people who are paying membership dues, or are these things that could be made available to a lot of different folks that, again, aren't able to pay those fees or be engaged in that way?
Mary, I want to back that up because we've had people ask to access the other pieces of the professional development series. We've had that same situation. And as like Tiffany and I have talked about it, it's frustrating and challenging because these are folks who could consider being a part of our membership, and this might be a way to draw them in, like you're talking to a student, and if they can't then access some of the things like this that might be what they see as a value, it's another barrier.
Yeah, thanks, Donna. I appreciate that. And finally, we are working on a very hefty article with all of this data, much clearer than my presentation, PS, but really looking at how to present this data and the so what. We have really dived into a lot of the history of this organization. We've dived into just different pieces of what this information can give us in our understanding of where our organization can go from here. So we are looking forward to getting that published out there for our entire association and all folks that might be interested in learning more about the nuances of this data. So there are things happening, but it's not enough. So we're really hoping that you guys can look forward to how to be further engaged. So here are all our emails. If you guys have any questions, we really thank you for your time today. Again, we know that this is just the beginning of a really in-depth conversation. Nothing happens quickly. So that's all I've got for you. Thank you for being here.
Mary, real quick, this